Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were a famous American criminal couple from the early 20th century. They are widely known as outlaws who became iconic figures in American history. Clyde's early life. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, on a small farm near Tellico, Texas, about 40 miles south of Dallas. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Henry and Cummy Barrow, poor tenant farmers who worked the land for little reward. Life was harsh. The Barrows didn't own their land. They farmed for someone else, barely keeping enough food on the table. Clyde grew up barefoot in the fields, working alongside his brothers and sisters from the time he was old enough to carry a hoe. By the early 1920s, farming could no longer sustain the family. The soil was poor, prices were collapsing, and the Great Depression had not even begun yet. Henry Barrow packed up his wife and children and moved them to West Dallas, where shanty houses sprang up overnight for poor families like theirs. The Barrows lived in a tent at first, later a cramped shack. West Dallas was rough, a place where poverty bred crime, and young Clyde absorbed it all. Still, Clyde wasn't without dreams. He loved music, and he longed to play the saxophone and the guitar. For a brief time, he imagined a different life, perhaps as a musician, traveling, entertaining, escaping the dirt roads of West Dallas. But money for instruments was scarce. Survival came first. By his teens, Clyde drifted toward the excitement of stealing. He started small, stealing chickens, slipping into neighbors' farms to take food. Later, he graduated to cars. Automobiles fascinated him, and stealing them became both a thrill and a way to make fast money. Soon he was on the police radar as a petty thief. It was the beginning of a path that led him far from the music he once dreamed of and into the life of an outlaw. Bonnie's early life. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1, 1910, in Rowena, Texas, a tiny farm town. She was the second of 3 children in a working-class family. Her father, Charles Parker, worked as a bricklayer, but when he died unexpectedly in 1914, Bonnie was only 4 years old. Her mother, Emma, now a widow with 3 small children, moved the family to Cement City, a poor industrial neighborhood in West Dallas. Cement City was crowded, rough, and poor, but it gave Bonnie her toughness. From an early age, Bonnie stood out. She was intelligent, lively, and creative. At school, she excelled in writing, winning praise from teachers for her poetry. She was also petite, just 4'10", but carried herself with confidence. She had a flair for drama and dreamed of becoming an actress or a performer. Bonnie also had a romantic streak. At 15, she met and married Roy Thornton, a fellow high school student. The marriage was troubled almost from the start. Roy was off and gone, drifting between jobs, and eventually got into trouble with the law. By the time Bonnie was 16, he had disappeared from her life. She wore his wedding ring until the day she died, but the marriage was effectively over. By her late teens, Bonnie was back living with her mother, working as a waitress in Dallas. Customers remembered her as friendly and spirited, often chatting with them while scribbling verses in a notebook. She was restless, though. Her world felt too small, and she longed for something larger, something exciting. 2 lives converging. In West Dallas, Bonnie and Clyde lived only a few miles apart. Both had grown up poor, both carried dreams that were crushed by the weight of hardship, and both had been hardened by their environment. Clyde's charm and Bonnie's fiery loyalty would prove irresistible when their paths crossed. But before that fateful meeting in January 1930, both were already being shaped by poverty, loss, and a restless desire for more than life seemed willing to give them. T was January 1930, in West Dallas. Bonnie Parker was 19 years old, still living with her mother after her failed marriage, and working as a waitress. Clyde Barrow was 20, already drifting deeper into crime, but still more boy than man. They met at the home of a mutual friend, Some say it was Bonnie's friend Clarence Clay's house. Bonnie had come over to help with cooking. Clyde was visiting a fellow gang member. The story goes that Bonnie was in the kitchen, making hot chocolate, when Clyde walked in. He was charming, well-dressed despite his poverty, and carried himself with confidence. Bonnie, petite with lively eyes and a sharp wit, caught his attention immediately. Bonnie later told friends she felt a spark the moment they met, as if their lives had suddenly intertwined. Within hours, she was smitten. Clyde too felt the pull. He had been with women before, but none who looked at him with the same intensity, the same devotion. From that day, they were inseparable. Bonnie even wrote in her poetry about meeting someone who would take her down a dangerous path, almost as if she foresaw her fate. When Clyde was arrested only weeks later for car theft, Bonnie proved her loyalty. She smuggled a pistol into jail, hidden inside her clothes, and passed it to him. Clyde used it to escape, though he was recaptured within a week. That act, reckless and bold, cemented their bond. Bonnie wasn't just a girlfriend. She was his partner, willing to risk everything. For Clyde, that loyalty meant more than anything. He had grown up poor, overlooked, and dismissed. Bonnie's devotion made him feel invincible. After his recapture, Clyde was sentenced to serve time at Eastham Prison Farm, one of the most notorious prisons in Texas. It was not just a place of confinement, it was a place of breaking men. Eastham was built like a plantation. Prisoners were forced into chain gangs, working long hours in the fields under the brutal Texas sun. Guards carried shotguns and used trusties, favored prisoners, to keep others in line. Beatings, whippings, and abuse were daily occurrences. Clyde entered Eastham at just 21 years old. Small, wiry, and defiant, he quickly became a target. Older inmates preyed on him. One in particular repeatedly assaulted him. Clyde endured the attacks for months, but inside, rage built. Finally, in desperation, Clyde killed the man. Armed with a piece of lead pipe, he struck his tormentor dead. It was the first life he ever took. Another inmate took responsibility for the killing to protect Clyde, but the act changed him forever. He had crossed a line he could never return from. The prison hardened him. Gone was the young man who once dreamed of music. In his place grew a ruthless survivor who vowed never again to be caged. In an attempt to escape hard labor, Clyde took a drastic step. He deliberately chopped off 2 of his toes with an axe, hoping disability would exempt him from field work. The injury left him with a limp for the rest of his life. Ironically, he was paroled just 6 days later. When Clyde walked out of Eastham in 1932, he was no longer the same. He told Bonnie he would never go back alive. He would die fighting before surrendering to prison again. That vow shaped everything that followed. It meant that every police stop, every roadblock, every attempted arrest would end in gunfire. Clyde was a man with nothing left to lose. After Clyde's release from Eastham in 1932, he was a changed man. Hardened, limping from his self-inflicted toe injury, and carrying deep scars from prison, he vowed never to be captured alive. But Clyde wasn't alone. By his side was Bonnie Parker, loyal to the end. Together, they drifted back to West Dallas, where petty criminals and outcasts like themselves were everywhere. It was here that the Barrow Gang began to take shape. Early associates. At first, Clyde's gang was nothing more than neighborhood friends. He teamed up with Raymond Hamilton, a young thief with a sharp temper, and W.D. Jones, a 16-year-old runaway who idolized Clyde and followed him like a kid brother. Bonnie quickly became part of their operations, not just a girlfriend, but a lookout, driver, and sometimes participant. Though stories of her shooting rifles are exaggerated by newspapers, she was fully committed to the life. Their robberies were small, rural gas stations, small-town stores, isolated diners. Clyde wasn't aiming for million-dollar bank jobs. He wanted quick money, cars, and guns, things that kept them on the move. Clyde's tactics. Clyde had 2 obsessions, speed and firepower. He stole Ford the 5th 8S, which he praised in letters as the best getaway car in the world. Police cars simply couldn't keep up. He carried Browning automatic rifles, bars, stolen from National Guard armories. They fired .30 caliber rounds capable of piercing car doors and even light armor. With these tools, Clyde built a reputation for escaping tight corners. Police roadblocks often ended with Clyde blasting through in a Ford the 5th 8, bullets ricocheting off the car's steel body. The Joplin Shootout, April 1933. The gang's first brush with true infamy came in Joplin, Missouri. In April 1933, Bonnie, Clyde, Buck, Blanche, and young W.D. Jones rented a garage apartment. They weren't careful. Neighbors complained about drunken laughter, cars arriving at odd hours, and gunfire echoing from the building. Clyde and Buck often fired rifles for target practice in the apartment. Local police believed they were bootleggers. On April 13th, 5 officers quietly surrounded the place. They had no idea they were walking into a hornet's nest. As officers approached, Clyde opened fire with his Browning automatic rifle. In seconds, chaos erupted. Buck joined in, blasting away with pistols. 2 lawmen, Detective Harry McGinnis and Constable Wes Harriman, were killed instantly. Bonnie ran to the getaway car, covering the men with pistol shots. Blanche screamed for them to leave. W.D. Jones, just a teenager, fired wildly out the back window. The gang roared out of Joplin, bullets shattering glass as they sped away. In their haste, they left everything: weapons, stolen goods, clothing, and a camera with undeveloped film. When the film was processed, it revealed striking images. Bonnie posing with a pistol, cigar clenched between her teeth. Clyde grinning, cradling rifles. The couple in playful, almost theatrical stances. The newspapers devoured them. Overnight, Bonnie and Clyde weren't just outlaws, they were celebrities. Life on the Run, 1933 to 1934. The reality was far less glamorous than the press made it seem. The Barrow Gang lived in constant motion. They drove hundreds of miles a day, often sleeping in stolen cars, abandoned farmhouses, or open fields. Money was scarce. Most robberies netted only a few dollars. They survived on cold cans of beans and stolen bread. In June 1933, tragedy struck in Wellington, Texas. Clyde crashed their stolen Ford at high speed, flipping the car into a ravine. A battery acid spill burned Bonnie's legs so badly that bone was exposed. She never fully healed. From then on, she limped badly, and Clyde often carried her. Despite her injury, Bonnie refused to leave him. Friends begged her to go home, but she laughed it off, writing poetry about their doomed romance. The gang grew smaller. Buck Barrow was mortally wounded in a July shootout in Dexter, Iowa, and Blanche was captured. By late 1933, only Bonnie, Clyde, and a few recruits like Henry Methvin remained. The Grapevine Killings, April 1934. On April 1, 1934, Easter Sunday, Bonnie and Clyde, along with Henry Methvin, encountered 2 young Texas highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. Accounts differ. Some claim Methvin opened fire impulsively, others say Clyde encouraged it. What is certain is that the officers were shot and killed at point-blank range. The press exploded. Sensational headlines claimed Bonnie laughed as she executed one of the men, though this was almost certainly false. Still, the damage was done. Public sympathy, once mixed, evaporated overnight. The killings turned Bonnie and Clyde from romantic outlaws into public enemies. Even ordinary citizens, once impressed by their defiance, now demanded their capture or death. The hunt intensifies. Texas authorities knew they needed a specialist to bring the gang down. They hired retired Texas Ranger Frank Hamer. Hamer was tall, taciturn, and deadly experienced. He had survived dozens of gunfights in his career. For months, he studied Bonnie and Clyde's patterns, their routes through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, their reliance on certain families, their habit of circling back to familiar hideouts. Hamer realized they traveled in a looping pattern, always returning to Dallas to see family. Patiently, he closed in. The weak link was Henry Methvin. His father, Ivy Methvin, agreed to cooperate with lawmen in exchange for leniency for his son. Together, they devised a trap. The Ambush, May 23, 1934. The trap was set on a lonely road outside Gibbsland, Louisiana. Ivy Methvin's truck was staged with a missing tire, left at the roadside to lure Bonnie and Clyde into stopping. Before dawn on May 23, 1934, 6 officers, Frank Hamer, B.M. Manny Galt, Henderson Jordan, Prentice Oakley, Bob Alcorn, and Ted Hinton, concealed themselves in the brush. At 9:15 a.m., Clyde's beloved Ford V8 appeared, roaring down the highway. He slowed at the sight of Ivy's truck. Bonnie, beside him, laughed and reached for a sandwich. They had just bought breakfast at Ma Canfield's cafe. The lawman opened fire. Oakley's first shot struck Clyde in the head, killing him instantly. The car lurched forward. Officers unleashed more than 160 rounds in less than 20 seconds. Bullets tore through glass, metal, and flesh. Bonnie screamed before she, too, was cut down. When it ended, the car was a twisted wreck, its occupants riddled with over 50 wounds each. The aftermath. The ambush scene quickly descended into chaos. Locals rushed in, tearing at the car for souvenirs, shell casings, shards of glass, even pieces of Bonnie's bloody hair and clothing. The Ford V8, now a mangled trophy, was hauled into town. Inside were more than a dozen guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and license plates from across the country. Their bodies were transported to Dallas. Thousands came to view them. Bonnie's funeral drew 20,000 mourners, Clyde's nearly as many. Despite Bonnie's wish to be buried beside Clyde, her mother insisted they rest apart. The bullet-riddled Ford toured carnivals for years before ending up in a Nevada casino museum, where it remains today. Legacy. Bonnie was just 23 years old. Clyde was 25. In only 2 years, they had robbed dozens of small businesses and banks, killed at least 13 people, and captured the attention of an entire nation. But their legend grew far larger than their crimes. Folk songs and ballads painted them as romantic rebels. Bonnie's own poems, like the story of Bonnie and Clyde, were published after her death, feeding the myth. In 1967, the film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, transformed them into icons of anti-establishment glamour. Yet the truth is darker. They were not Robin Hoods. They never gave money to the poor. They lived hungry, desperate, and on the run. Their love was real, but it was bound to a cycle of violence that could only end in tragedy. Nearly a century later, Bonnie and Clyde remained symbols, not of justice or rebellion, but of the thin line between romance and ruin, freedom and destruction.